They don't ask you to stay. They create a situation where you have to decide, if you will. And from the outside, it looks like distance, like disinterest, like something fading, for no clear reason. But underneath that, something very specific is happening. Because when someone has learned that closeness doesn't last, they don't trust it. When it finally shows up, not fully, not right away, even if they want to, because wanting connection and feeling safe inside it are not the same thing. So instead of leaning into it, they do something else, something quieter, less obvious. They step back, not dramatically, not in a way they would even explain as a test, but in a way that creates space. Space where you could leave, space where you could stop trying, space where you could decide it's not worth it anymore. And that space becomes the question they don't know how to ask directly. If I stop reaching, will you keep coming? If I go quiet, will you still stay present? If I don't give you certainty, will you still choose me? Not because they're trying to manipulate you, but because they're trying to understand something they don't feel secure in yet. Whether connection can exist without them controlling it. Because control has always been their version of safety, knowing when to engage, knowing when to pull back, keeping enough distance to never feel fully dependent on what happens next. But when something real starts forming, that control gets challenged because now there's something to lose, something that matters. And that's where fear enters. Not loud, not obvious, but steady, because now they're not just in a connection, they're in something that could affect them. And when something can affect them, they don't just stay inside it. They test its stability, not through direct questions, but through indirect space. Because asking, will you stay, requires vulnerability, but creating distance gives them an answer without having to ask. And that's the part that gets misunderstood. Because from your side, you experience the distance as withdrawal, as inconsistency, as something changing. But from their side, they're watching, not intensely, not in a controlling way, but quietly aware of what happens next. Do you chase? Do you pull back? Do you match their distance? Or do you stay steady without forcing anything? And your response doesn't just affect the dynamic, it informs how safe the connection feels to them. Because if your presence disappears, the moment they step back, it confirms something they already expect, that closeness is temporary, that people leave when things aren't easy. But if you stay, not chasing, not overextending, just steady, it creates something unfamiliar. Consistency, without pressure. Presence, without demand. And that's where their system gets conflicted. Because part of them feels relief in that, feels something stable they don't usually experience. But another part doesn't fully trust it yet. Because it didn't come from their control. It came from you, choosing to stay, and being chosen without controlling the outcome isn't something they've learned to rely on. So the pattern continues. They step back again, create space again, not to push you away, but to see if what you showed before holds. And this is where people get stuck, because it starts to feel like you have to prove something, like your consistency is being measured, like your presence has to pass some invisible threshold. But here's the truth. It's not a test you're meant to pass. It's a pattern they haven't resolved, because no amount of you staying can fully replace their need to feel safe staying themselves. And that's the shift most people don't see early enough. They think, if I just stay consistent, they'll finally feel secure. But consistency, from the outside, can't fully regulate what's happening on the inside. It can help, It can show something different, but it can't complete the process for them. Because the real question isn't whether you'll stay, it's whether they can remain present once they realize you might. And that's where everything starts to change. Because the moment your consistency becomes real, not temporary, not reactive, but stable, it stops being something they can casually test. It becomes something they have to face. And facing it requires a version of them that doesn't rely on distance to feel safe because they're used to something, a rhythm. They pull back, and the other person either chases harder or disappears completely. Both outcomes make sense to their system. One confirms control, the other confirms detachment. But when you do neither, when you stay, without chasing, without withdrawing, just steady, it creates something unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't always feel safe at first, even when it's healthy, because now their usual way of reading the situation doesn't apply. You're still there, but you're not trying to close the distance. You're not demanding clarity. You're not over-explaining your position. You're just present consistently. And that consistency starts to shift what they feel internally. At first, there's a kind of relief because nothing is escalating. Nothing is being pushed. No pressure to respond perfectly. No urgency to match your energy. Everything feels calm. But then, that calm starts to change because it doesn't go away. It stays. And when something steady stays, it becomes real, not temporary, not situational, but consistent enough to be relied on. And that's where the pressure begins to rise. Not from you, from what that consistency means. Because now, they're not just observing whether you'll stay, they're realizing you might actually stay. And that realization hits differently because it removes their usual buffer. The idea that this will fade anyway. This won't last. I don't have to fully engage. Now, those assumptions don't hold as easily because your behavior isn't matching them. And when those assumptions drop, something underneath them gets exposed. Responsibility. Because if you're not leaving and you're not chasing, then the dynamic is no longer being driven by your reaction. It's being held by your presence. And that shifts everything. Because now, they can't just stay passive. They can't just observe from a distance. At some point, they have to decide how they're going to show up. And that's where the discomfort sharpens. Because deciding how to show up means stepping out of automatic patterns. It means choosing rather than reacting. And choosing requires awareness. It requires them to feel what's actually happening without immediately regulating it through distance. And that's unfamiliar territory because now it's not about whether you'll stay. It's about whether they can stay present while you do. And staying present means feeling everything their system usually avoids: the closeness, the openness, the lack of control, the possibility that this could become something real. And that last part is where things intensify because something real doesn't just mean connection. It means impact. It means being affected. It means caring enough that it matters what happens next. And when it matters, they can't stay neutral anymore. They can't stay distant without feeling it. They can't stay close without being affected by it. So the internal tension increases because now the space they created to feel safe isn't working the same way. You didn't fill it with pressure, but you also didn't leave it empty. You stayed in it. And that presence makes everything more visible to them because now they're not just watching you. They're noticing themselves, how they respond, how they pull back, how they hesitate. when things feel steady, and that awareness doesn't immediately create change. It creates exposure, because now they can see the pattern as it's happening, and seeing it means they can't fully pretend it's just about you anymore. They can't fully say, this is too much, because nothing about you is actually overwhelming. So the explanation shifts from this isn't right to something less comfortable. I don't know why. This feels like too much. And that question opens something deeper, because now they're not just testing whether you'll stay, they're facing the reality that you already are. And that reality removes the distraction, because before, the focus was on you, what you were doing, how you were responding, whether you chase or pull away. But now, the focus turns inward, toward their own reaction, their own discomfort, their own inability to fully relax into something that isn't threatening them. And that's where the conflict begins to form, because part of them recognizes what you're offering, sees the consistency, feels the steadiness, but another part still doesn't know how to receive it without bracing. And those two parts don't resolve easily. They pull in different directions. One moves toward, the other pulls back. And the more consistent you are, the more both sides activate. Because now, it's not about testing anymore. It's about what your presence is forcing them to feel. And what it's forcing them to feel is something they can't control the same way they used to. Because at this point, they're not just reacting, they're divided internally between what they feel and what they can handle. And those two things are no longer aligned, because part of them has already registered you, not casually, not as something temporary, but as something real, something steady enough to matter, something different enough to be noticed. And that part doesn't want distance. It doesn't need testing. It doesn't question whether this could work. It simply recognizes that it already feels different, calmer, clearer, more grounded than what they're used to. And that recognition creates a pull, not loud, not overwhelming, but consistent, a quiet awareness that staying connected would feel right if everything inside them was aligned with it. But it isn't, because at the same time, another part of them is still active, still scanning, still interpreting closeness as something that will eventually require more than they can give, still anticipating the moment things shift from easy to demanding. And that anticipation carries more weight than the present moment, because their system isn't just responding to now, it's predicting what comes next. And what comes next feels like loss of control, more expectation, more emotional exposure, more responsibility to stay consistent in a way they're not used to sustaining. So even though nothing has gone wrong, they start preparing for something that hasn't happened. And preparation looks like distance, looks like hesitation, looks like holding back just enough to keep everything manageable. And this is where the contradiction becomes visible, because from your side, it feels like inconsistency. Moments where they lean in, then pull back. Moments where they're present, then suddenly unavailable. Moments where it feels like they're right there, and then not. But from their side, it's not random, it's regulation. They move closer when the connection feels calm. They pull back when it starts to feel real. And the difference between those two states is almost invisible externally, but internally, it's everything. Because calm feels manageable, but real feels like something they'll have to sustain. And sustaining it feels like pressure, even if you're not applying any. So they stay in between, close enough to not lose the connection, distant enough to not feel overwhelmed by it. But that middle space isn't stable because the part of them that feels connection doesn't stop feeling it just because they created distance. If anything, distance makes it clearer because now there's space to notice it, to think about you, without the immediate activation of being close, to replay conversations, to remember how it felt when everything was simple. And those moments don't feel threatening, they feel right. And that's where the tension increases because now they're holding two truths at the same time. This feels right. This feels like too much. And both feel real. Both feel valid. So neither one gets dismissed. They just coexist. And when two opposing feelings coexist without resolution, they create friction because now every choice feels incomplete. Move closer and risk activation. Stay distant and feel the absence of something that mattered. So instead of choosing, they hover. They stay connected, just enough to not fully lose you, but not enough to fully build something either. And this is where attachment forms. Without movement, they think about you. They feel the connection. They recognize the difference, but they don't step fully into it because stepping fully into it means stepping into everything that comes with it: the vulnerability, the consistency, the emotional presence. That doesn't turn off when things get real. And that's the part they don't fully trust themselves to maintain. So instead, they stay in a controlled version of connection where they can feel it without fully risking it. But that control comes with a cost because now they're not just managing the connection, they're managing themselves inside it, constantly adjusting, constantly pulling back just before it feels like too much, constantly trying to keep everything within a range that feels safe enough to stay in, but not safe enough to fully relax into. And over time, that effort becomes exhausting because holding something at a distance while still feeling it requires energy, attention, control. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to maintain that balance because the part of them that feels something isn't going anywhere. It stays quiet, but present, waiting, not for you to prove anything, but for the conflict inside them to resolve. And until it does, this pattern repeats: closer, then distance, connection, then control, feeling, then regulation. And from the outside, it looks unclear, but from the inside, it's very precise. They're not unsure about you. They're unsure about what happens inside them when they get close to you. At first, the distance helped. It gave them room to regulate, to lower the intensity, to feel like they were back in control. But control comes with a trade-off because while it reduces what they feel, it also reduces what they experience. And over time, that becomes noticeable, not immediately, but gradually, in small, quiet ways. Other interactions feel easier, but less meaningful, less activating, but also less real, less demanding, but also less alive. And that contrast starts to build awareness because now they're not just avoiding discomfort, they're recognizing what that avoidance removed: the depth, the clarity, the sense of something actually forming. And once something is recognized as meaningful, its absence doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels like something missing. And that's where the pressure begins. Not from you, from within. Because the part of them that felt something hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, still aware of what the connection was, still comparing without trying to. And now it starts asking questions they can't easily dismiss. Why did I pull away? Was it actually too much? Or did it just feel like it? Did I step back from something real? And those questions don't come with quick answers, because the answers challenge the pattern they've relied on, the one that says distance equals safety, because now distance doesn't feel entirely safe. It feels limiting, incomplete, like something is missing that shouldn't be missing. And that realization creates a different kind of tension, not just activation, but conflict with their own response. Because now, they're not just reacting automatically, they're seeing the reaction, watching it happen, noticing how they pull back when things feel steady, noticing how they create space when something becomes real. And that awareness doesn't calm the system, it exposes it, because now they can't fully say, "This was too much," because nothing about you was actually overwhelming. So the explanation shifts from certainty to uncertainty. I don't know why. This felt like too much. And that question opens something deeper, because now they're not just managing the connection, they're questioning themselves. Why can't I just stay? Why does something calm feel like something I need to escape? Why does this keep happening? And those questions don't feel abstract. They feel personal, because now it's not about you anymore. It's about how they function inside connection. And that realization starts to affect how they see themselves. Because before, they could rely on the idea that distance was the right move, that pulling back was necessary, that it kept things balanced. But now, that belief doesn't hold as strongly, because they can see what it cost them, what it removed, what it interrupted. And once that cost becomes clear, distance doesn't feel like a clean solution anymore. It feels like a compromise, one that protects them, but also keeps them from fully experiencing what they actually want. And that's where the internal pressure sharpens, because now they're holding two truths at the same time. Closeness feels real, closeness feels unsafe, and both feel true. So neither one resolves. They just sit there, creating tension, because now every option comes with weight. Move closer and risk activation again. Stay distant and sit with the awareness that something real was left behind. And that awareness slowly shifts into something deeper, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady. Loss, because now they're not just remembering you, they're understanding what the connection was, what it offered, what it required, and what they couldn't stay inside of. And that understanding makes the distance feel different, not just necessary, but costly, because now they can see both sides, what they protected and what they gave up to protect it. And that's the part that doesn't resolve quickly, because awareness, without change, creates weight, and that weight doesn't disappear. It stays until something shifts. Either they move toward it, or they learn to shut it down completely. But staying in between becomes harder to maintain, because now it's not just about managing feeling. It's about facing the reality that what they stepped away from wasn't something unstable. It was something real. And what made it feel unsafe wasn't you. It was how their system experienced it.